are listening to In Pursuit of Development with Dan Banik.
Welcome back to In Pursuit of Development. Today, we're taking a fresh look at an idea that has shaped how millions of people and plenty of policymakers think about progress: human development. Not as a slogan, but as a simple and demanding proposition. People should be able to live lives they have reason to value. Early last year in New Delhi, on the margins of a conference, I had one of those brief and very memorable conversations with Meghnad Desai, reminiscing about the early days of the Human Development Report alongside Mahbub-ul-Haq and Amartya Sen. What struck me was how much of this human development agenda was born from lived experience in South Asia, then sharpened by Haq and then Sen's capabilities approach, and subsequently codified into something governments could actually track and argue about. That blend, moral purpose with practical metrics, still matters. Which brings me to my guest. Pedro Conceição is the director of the UNDP Human Development Report Office. Under his leadership, the Human Development Reports have become both tougher and more usable, pairing clear analysis with the kind of data that can't be ignored. In our conversation, we revisit the core of the idea of human development and how it travels in this polarized world of ours. When our attention is focused on war, famine, and catastrophe, what does it mean to keep people's capabilities at the center of policy? We also talk about the Human Development Index, HDI, what it captures, what it can't, and why the politics of moving up a category may still and usefully change incentives. And yes, we go beyond the league table headlines to the more interesting questions of progress and setbacks. We then turn to a subject that seems to be everywhere right now: artificial intelligence. Not the hype or the fear-mongering, but the practical and human-led uses that can genuinely expand people's capabilities, such as improving learning, healthcare, livelihoods, and the public services that hold societies together. This is also the focus of the current Human Development Report, titled A Matter of Choice, People and Possibilities in the Age of AI. Pedro and I explore where AI can truly complement human judgment and where it must never be allowed to replace it. Threaded through this is a concern close to many listeners: energy poverty and the foundational infrastructure that development still requires. You'll hear a discussion about the prerequisites that aren't glamorous but are decisive: electricity, connectivity, and the institutions that can turn technology into real gains. If you're a long-time follower of the Human Development Reports, you'll appreciate the perspective from inside the engine room. And if you're new to the conversation, consider this an invitation to look past headlines toward the choices, political and practical, that can make progress stick. If you find this conversation useful, please share it, rate the show, and help spread the word about In Pursuit of Development. It helps keep these conversations alive and reach new audiences. Thank you. Pedro, it's lovely to see you again. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan. Pleasure. I'm a great admirer of your show, and it's an honor for me to be here.
Well, the last time we met was in New Delhi in 2024, January. And one of the things I remember distinctly, apart from talking to you, is I had a ringside chat with Meghnad Desai, one of those early architects of this Human Development Report and the idea, together with Mahbub-ul-Haq and Amartya Sen. And this was a short 20-minute conversation on the sidelines of that event you and I were attending. And it was really fascinating to hear him speak about the relevance of the concept and how it grew from a little idea that friends discussed to something this important. So, Pedro, I want to get us started with asking you, in this polarized world that we live in, with all these geopolitical tensions, our attention is focused on wars and famines and genocides. How relevant is the concept of human development today? When you travel around the world and you present the human development reports, we'll get back to that slightly later in the conversation, are people still hanging on and saying human development is important, this is what we need to prioritize?
Well, let me start then by mentioning a recent book by David Engerman, a historian. He just put out a book a month ago or so called Apostles of Development. And in that book, it traces the history of Amartya Sen and Mahbub ul Haq and others, and how the ideas around human development emerged. And so I start with this point because it's very interesting to see the historical origin of human development, and that it's something that came from South Asia, right? This is not an idea that was cooked up in universities. So I think it's very important to emphasize the point that it came from the lived experience of Mahbub and Amartya and others, upon which then a scaffolding of concepts, the capabilities approach of Amartya Sen, emerge finally in this notion of human development. That is a very simple idea, and that leads me to directly answer your question. So the idea of human development is that people should be able to live their lives to their full potential. If we take this idea, you can see how it's not only relevant, I would argue that it's now more relevant than ever.
And I support you. I mean, I am a huge fan of human development. Amartya Sen is my mentor. There's nothing more important than promoting human development. And yet our attention span is shorter these days. I suppose there is more of a difference between the global North's priorities and the global South's priorities. I think that was a very important point you mentioned, that the concept originated in the global South. And I will put it to you that a lot of the debate or a lot of the differences that we see in terms of disagreements that we see nowadays is precisely because there are some countries who want more human development, and some countries are accused of not providing the resources for that promotion of human development. I'm thinking about aid that is shrinking all around the world, the support for the 2030 agenda, and the SDGs. I mean, how on earth is it possible that one does not support these very universal values? So it is in that setting, Pedro, I'm wondering whether you hear people, policymakers saying, yeah, I've actually made progress on the HDI index. I've moved from low human development to medium human development. That kind of stuff. Is that happening?
It is happening. And I think the point you made about Human Development Index is very important. The Human Development Index is not the whole idea of human development. It's a relatively narrow metric, but it's one that allows us to understand whether we're making progress or not, and what kind of countries are making progress, or what countries are making progress or not. So I think one of the power of the idea of human development is that it didn't just stay at the level of a concept, of an aspiration, of an abstraction, but came along with metrics. And so to answer your question directly, yes, people care about it. Every time that we publish a human development report, as you know, human development report has different themes, but a lot of the attention actually still goes to the ranking of countries, as well as to the progress on whether it's happening or not. So I'll just give you briefly two findings of the latest Human Development Report about the state of human development as measured by the Human Development Index. So the two headline findings that I want to highlight are, first, that even though there is progress on human development globally, on average, the pace of progress is slowing down. If we project the current trends of progress in human development, they are much slower than we've had up to, say, 2020. And the second very important finding is that the difference in the level of the Human Development Index between the countries at the top and the countries at the bottom, that has been narrowing for decades, is now increasing. So we moved from a process of convergence in human development, which is what development is all about. It's what the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda are all about. It's what the aspiration of development is all about, from one in which we're actually seeing a divergence in human development.
Yeah, and that is exactly what Meghnad Desai told me. And also in my discussions with Amartya Sen, this is many years ago, he would say that operationalizing the idea of human development through the HDI was actually a very neat thing to do, because policymakers like rankings. And One can criticize these as being rather, I mean, you can't really capture every dimension, but the very fact that you're doing better than your rival, that attracts attention.
I think another important point of human development that in a way was a presage or something that foreshadowed the Sustainable Development Goals is its universality.
Yeah.
The Human Development Index was not calculated only for a set of countries. And I think this idea that we can sort of break countries up into groups, however you want to define it, goes against this notion of human development that is really a universal aspiration of enabling people everywhere to live lives to their full potential. And that's something that ultimately was also reflected in the SDGs, which is a set of targets that are meant for everybody, for every country.
Unlike the MDGs.
Unlike the MDGs, exactly.
You've been to Norway many times, and here over the last few decades, whenever we don't figure as number one on the HDI, we get a lot of interesting questions from journalists saying, what's happening? Is Norway not the best country in the world? And the latest one, I think it is Iceland, which is number one, and Norway is number two. But the point here is that category of high human development isn't really that interesting. What is interesting for me is the bottom list. And you have South Sudan, you have Chad, you have Central African Republic. I suppose it is when you look at those countries and you compare them from year to year and you see movements upwards that you really notice. I suppose the low human development and medium human development are the categories that are really interesting. Would you agree?
Well, I think all categories are interesting. And as you mentioned, we actually have four, right? And what's interesting to see is that countries are actually sort of graduating from low to medium, from medium to high, and some from high to very high human development. And this is something that we're seeing in addition to the improvement in the global average that I alluded to, that we see countries sort of graduating to higher levels of human development.
What's a good case, Pedro? Would it be Bangladesh as one?
I mean, there are many cases that have happened over. It depends on the time scale that we're considering. You have cases like the Republic of Korea, for instance. You have cases like Bangladesh, Vietnam. Turkey recently also moved to, I believe, the very high level of human development. So there are a number of Indonesia. So there are many countries that move from one category to the other, and that is picked up quite a bit and gets a lot of attention. And that was the intention of the index, right? The intention of the index was not to enable countries to move to be like Norway overnight, but to give this sense of progression and sort of give incentives for countries to move up the ladder of human development.
And it's not always upward mobility, it's also downward mobility, right?
Exactly,
which is interesting.
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about the current report. And everybody is talking about AI. That is like the buzzword. In academia, in policymaking, it's AI. So I suppose that's why you guys also picked up on this. And one of the things, Pedro, that frustrates me is that usually the discussion in our parts of the world is potentially on most of the negative stuff related to democracy, governance, election manipulation. And these are really concerning aspects, how AI can be used and abused. What I don't see enough discussion on, and that is why I thought your report was very good, is how can AI be mobilized as a resource to promote human development, to promote sustainable development, to fight climate change. So give us a little sense of how AI is a positive, a force multiplier, because I know in the report you are concerned, you and your co-authors are concerned about how, we perhaps as humans risk losing control over the development of AI. And this is something I've spoken extensively with Darun Acemoglu on this show, his book with Simon Johnson, Power and Progress. And I was actually reminded of that yesterday, Pedro. I was looking at a video on YouTube. President Trump invited all the tech leaders to the White House for a dinner, and the talk was only about AI. It was about AI changing the world. So give us a little sense of AI in the positive way. How can we think of AI in relation to education, health, social protection? How can AI help promote human development around the world?
Let me first then tell you about how did we come to the choice of this topic.
Okay.
Right? Why AI, right?
Yeah.
And so we are actually undertaking what we call a trilogy of reports that emanated actually from the 2022 Human Development Report, in which we argue that we are living through a context in which our environment, our societies are changing very rapidly. And we identified three ways in which we are actually facing what we call the novel context of uncertainty. So one has to do with the context of political polarization, which was the topic of last year's Human Development Report. Second, very rapid technological change, particularly on AI, and that defined the theme and the topic for this year's Human Development Report. And then finally, planetary change, climate change, biodiversity loss, which is the topic of the 2026 Human Development Report. Now, our report is a human development report, right? So it's not a report about the technology. And I think that's something that makes it distinctive, as you alluded to. So basically, the headline message of the report is that we should not allow our future to be determined by the technology, and we should not expect our future to be determined by the technology or by the capabilities of the technology. So around AI, we see this discourse that it's a technology where machines are getting to acquire the capabilities of people. And therefore, implication is that people should be replaced by AI or are at risk of being replaced by AI. And I think Dara Nashimoglu has a very good expression in which he warns us about the risks of deploying so-so AI.
Yeah.
So deploying AI in tasks, in activities, in actually humans are doing a good job. So if we go that route, I think this is very dangerous because you won't have the gains in productivity, the economic gains that you would get because humans are actually doing the job very well.
And also critical thinking. I mean, just that aspect is not there yet.
Exactly. And you'd get displacement, right? You get people displaced by machines without any gains, and also without the many negative effects associated with AI when it comes to the use of resources, for instance. I mean, natural resources like energy and water. Now, we can also look at the sort of the potential of AI and how is AI different and how is AI today different from what it was a few years ago. So we can also go into some of these points that we explore in the report then.
I was just thinking, reading the report, I thought of, that old Western film, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So the good, I would say, and you have examples of this in terms of education, obviously making sure that children and those who don't have access to quality education in terms of information, etc., one could bridge that gap. But I notice in the report, it says you can't not focus on teachers, their working conditions. It is not just the technocratic aspect. It's also that human-led education, that critical thinking that is important. But I also saw, that the other area where one often talks about AI is health. One example that you guys use in the report about radiologists, imaging and how AI can, make this process very quick. And I know this is happening already and the errors are very, very small. But even then, the good thing there is that initial fear, as you were saying, maybe a few years ago, there was this initial fear that you would lose jobs, that radiologists would not have jobs. That fear has not happened. But anyway, so education, health would be the good ones, right? And then there are lots of examples of social protection. Just a simple thing like I remember using mobile phones to transfer cash in sub-Saharan Africa. That was good. I'm sure AI can help with that. So this is all the good stuff. But I suppose with every one of these examples, Pedro, there are concerns that we will lose control over the development. And then you could say, okay, the good and then the bad, maybe there will be some sort of job loss with automation, but how can we reskill workers, that? And then the ugly would be loss of trust in society, I suppose, right? I mean, we become even more polarized than we have.
Sure, Dan. So first, let me refer to some of the findings of a survey that we conducted for the report. So we asked people around the world, first of all, whether they were using AI or not. And we found that 20% of the population, roughly, across or respondents to the survey, across all levels of human development, reported being users of AI already. And then we asked whether people expected to be using AI within the next year. And here the interesting finding was that 2/3 of people in lower levels of the Human Development Index reported this expectation. This was a little lower in very high HDI levels, where it was about half of respondents. So I think the first thing to bear in mind, and it's a collective responsibility of all of us, is that there's this expectation. This is not a prediction, right? But there's this expectation that AI is going to be part of people's lives, particularly in lower income.
But do they have access to that technology, Pedro?
That's the other point I wanted to make. When ChatGPT came online, which is the first, perhaps, mass large language model and generative AI, the first model of generative AI, it came online in November of 2022. Over 95% of the traffic that went through the ChatGPT website at that time came from high-income countries. A few months later, the majority of traffic was coming from middle-income countries. So AI was a technology that had been deployed for decades, really, by governments, by firms, in the military, in all sorts of applications. And we can discuss some of these applications. But where we are today is in a context in which AI is very accessible, particularly these forms of generative AI. And with this accessibility come the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? So I think it's important to understand that we are in a different context, and that's what the report tried to examine. So I think the sort of headline kind of perspective that the report suggests is that if, again, we look at AI as something that will replace people, or that will be a crutch, something that we outsource, for instance, our critical thinking, as you were alluding to when it comes to education, then that's problematic. But if we look at AI as a companion, as something that enables humans to do more of what they want to do, then there are many opportunities in education, in health, in economic activities. The final point I would make is, two important points. Like any technology, ultimately, the impact will depend not only on the technology as such, but the changes that happen around, for instance, production processes to make the most out of technology. If you think of AI as just plug and play, so there is a task that's now is done by humans, and then you just replace that task, you're not likely to get the gains. It may require some kind of reorganization of production process. And we've seen that with technologies again and again in the past. So this is something that makes AI, Arvind Narayan has a book coming up that calls AI a normal technology. So he wants to sort of demystify this idea that AI is something that's not going to go through the same process of engendering reorganization of production processes until it results in gains in productivity, for instance. But the other point I wanted to make is that there is something about AI that could make it potentially more impactful if we are smart enough to use it in that way, in that it's a tool that can amplify our, humans' creativity, right? In science, in artistic expression. Not as something that automates and makes us just produce more scientific papers, for instance, but as a tool to enable us to expand our creativity. So I think this is something that has great potential, and ultimately, perhaps the greatest potential of AI is in this ability, if we harness, I guess, this ability to expand our creativity.
It has to be human-led. All the inputs have to be human. And I suppose it would have to be a step-by-step process, not a finished result that one puts in, an input, something comes out, and then one, feeds it some more information. An incremental way of meandering, I suppose. But coming back to this idea of efficiency, Pedro, because I think about, I have a smart home. My lights get turned off and on, and the heaters and coolers, you name it, the sprinklers. And this is an ongoing disagreement I have with my wife. She says, all these gadgets we have, do we really need them? And it is true. We don't really need them. We can switch off lights, but it's fun. And I suppose it makes our jobs, lawnmower, a robotic lawnmower, a vacuum cleaner. These are things that for me, this is something like first world comfort. Every day there's something new saying, oh, there's a new box and this has the latest AI. This is smart, whether it's a television, a music system, whatever. But what I'm really interested in are those concrete examples of malaria protection using technology, making sure that doctors actually can provide advice to patients in remote areas, making sure that students have access to the latest books and articles, right? So it is those concrete ways of helping people achieve a higher level of human development. And I suppose one of the things where there's a lot of disagreement on is, and I know you're interested in, is how AI can be used for to fight climate change. Some people have put all their hopes on AI, whereas others say that is not going to do it. Going back to our earlier point, Pedro, I think the real danger is that we lose control over the evolution of this technology. It's moving so quickly. So do you see concrete ways in which we can intervene and shape and reshape the path of that technology? Or is it a runaway train that we can't control?
We are not in the report worried about losing control of the technology, and we can go into the reasons why. I want to go back to your point about how can AI be used for good. So this is to advance human development. I mean, every week I come across a new application, and I'll just give one for illustration, and it's about detecting anemia. Anemia is a debilitating condition, particularly in parts of Africa, and it can only be detected with a blood sample. So it's hard. You have to, collect the sample. You have to move it to a lab in certain conditions. So many cases of anemia, and we're talking about billions of people around the world, often go undetected and untreated. So a recent paper in the PNAS Proceedings of National Academy of Science showed an application in which people take a photo of a nail, and by taking a photo of a nail, an AI algorithm can give information about the level of anemia. So this is an example of this kind of applications. And, it's just one, but, there are always coming up new applications of this sort. And on a technology running out of control, I think the argument we make, and, who knows, right? Who knows? Who knows what the future will hold? The point we're trying to make is, and that's what the report is, a matter of choice. It may happen, but it does not have to happen. If it does happen, it's because we, humans, the choices we make, allow it to happen. Because this is something that is made by people, by humans. So it's a matter of choice, and it's not something that is inevitable, and it's not within the capabilities of the technology to determine that future.
There's something else I also noticed. I mean, there are lots of interesting graphs and figures in the latest Human Development Report. One was something you alluded to, that a lot of the demand, I think in 2024, for ChatGPT came from middle-income countries and low-income countries, not just the high-income countries. So that goes to your point about access. But there's the other aspect, Pedro, about the investments in AI. I was referring to President Trump's dinner with the American titans yesterday or day before. A lot of those are happening in the United States, China, and perhaps some parts of Europe, the UK. And there is a danger that much of this could become very Eurocentric, could become catering to our needs, how we understand problems. And to go back to our starting point, human development is about a universal value. It can't just be about what people think are important in Norway or the United States or Sweden, right? It has to be universal. And so there perhaps is also that danger. I don't want to talk too much about the dangers of AI, but who is shaping and who is it for? It has to be for the good. It has to be focused on those vulnerable to floods and cyclones in Bangladesh. It has to be focused on, eradicating extreme poverty, malaria, anemia. I suppose we're getting to the start of that era. And I'm glad you mentioned those apps. It reminded me of the one that I've started using for three weeks ago. It's called LifeSum, tracks my calories, how much I'm eating. So these are very useful. A photograph can just estimate what these are. But of course, there are lots of problems. It makes mistakes and you have to correct it. And that is what I'm learning, is that a picture with AI can identify certain things, but I'm the human providing that nuance.
Absolutely. So I think that you touched on three important points. First, maybe picking up on these sort of hallucinations. I think this is one reason for us to be very skeptical of just assuming that we can delegate human decisions, in particular, to AI, particularly when we confront high stakes decisions, life or death decisions, or a decision on whether someone should be in jail or not. So high stakes decisions, we should be careful in fully delegating them to AI. We can certainly use AI to help us to make those decisions, but fully automating, in a sense, we should be seen with care. And that's why AI, compared to digital technologies of the past that were used to automate many economic processes and even human decisions, is different, right? And creates more opportunities for complementarity. So I think this is an important point. Second point, going back to your first observation, it's not a risk, it's a reality. The current models, some of the large language models, are biased, culturally at least, towards representing the views of high HDI countries. There's a graph we have in the report. I don't know if you
I saw that.
noticed, where there's a very well-known international survey called the World Value Survey. So it's about values in society. The questions of the World Value Survey were posed to one of these large language models. And there's a very high correlation with the way in which people, humans in very high HDI countries, answer these questions and the answers that came from the large language model. As we move towards the way in which humans respond in lower levels of human development, the correlation declines. So in other words, the views, the values of people in many parts of the world are not represented in some of these large language models. So I think this is something important to bear in mind. But there are aspects that are not culturally contingent, right? Most of science, math, health intervention, mental health intervention. So I think there's also the potential to, even though there are concerns about bias and then the representation of segments of the population, particularly in health applications, I think these models are getting better. But this is certainly a concern that speaks to the importance of having lower HDI countries not being merely users of AI, but actually being part production side of AI.
And that's where the context specific thing comes in, right?
Exactly.
Because there may be, you're right. I mean, there are certain things that are universal. But even health interventions, I mean, in the global south, often health is not about the most expensive interventions. India talks about frugal innovation, low cost technologies, which in our parts of the world maybe is discarded.
Exactly.
Given that the context, given the amount of resources available, maybe one chooses, a policymaker will choose the third or fourth best option because that is what one can afford. So I suppose it's not just about preaching, saying, do this is the optimal solution. It has to be context specific.
And that's why it's so important to keep humans as part of this, right? So the potential is to empower a health worker in a village in India to have more resources. It's not to replace and to give sort of the patient relying directly on whatever AI gives, but it's empowering the person that has to deal with many people in a village, someone that is perhaps alone and has to attend to a relatively large population, more tools, more information to enable this person to provide more healthcare services. But I want to allude to one aspect that is really ugly, right? So we're talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the really ugly one has to do with the decline in the mental well-being of young people in many parts of the world. So if you look at evidence about how mental well-being is distributed across people's age, for a long time and across many countries, this had sort of a U-shaped. In other words, young people and older people reported higher levels of mental well-being than people sort of our age. So we are sort of in the bottom. More recently, in many countries, particularly higher income countries, but the evidence suggests that in other places as well, this curve has tilted. There's been a very sharp decline in the mental well-being of young people with more incidence in young women and girls. And this parallels the diffusion of many digital technologies powered by AI tools, smartphones and other devices. So there's an ongoing debate as to the causes and the policy remedies, but it's certainly AI and diffusion of AI and AI tools is part of the story that is playing a part in this decline in the mental well-being of young people.
And this is a big issue in Norway, as in many other parts of the world. We just finished an election campaign where, in one of the debates, the leaders were asked to show the amount of time they spend on their phones. Because we are just not interacting with other humans as much as we should.
Just a note, because you may think, okay, this is just something that is a concern in high-income countries. The intensity of use of social media, intensity, right? Not the scale, not the number of people using social media, but the intensity of use of social media is much higher in low HDI countries. Obviously, not everybody has access, but of those that have access, compared to the global average, they use social media much more.
Yep.
So I think that if we think of this sort of from a development perspective, we may be in a position to get ahead of the problem and not wait until a context in which this is a problem that is actually universal, as opposed to perhaps have more intensity in higher HDI countries.
I was thinking about when I interact with my colleagues in South Africa, Malawi, Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, or Nairobi, particularly on the African continent, there's one thing that is always coming through in all of these interactions with students, with policymakers, with my academic colleagues, and that is, how can AI help us address the energy poverty issue? 600 million people without access to electricity, 900 million people on the continent using coal and firewood. And there is this frustration, that years of neglect in infrastructure, and this is something I know you're also interested in, is that AI alone is not just going to do it. One has to also build the infrastructure, particularly on the African continent. And I really hope that we just don't think about this one thing and forget the other aspect. And energy poverty, as you know, I mean, it's just shocking, Pedro, that we haven't been able to make progress in that part of the world, whereas there is progress in many others, particularly in relation to electrification rates.
I agree with you, Dan, and I heard the same frustration when we, went around. We have a process of consultations, but here's the interesting thing I'm interpreted what nobody told me this explicitly, but this is what I felt, and hopefully the report somehow captures this idea. We can think of three important technological revolutions. There's the electricity revolution, the internet revolution, and now the AI revolution. So what I felt was that many people felt that they had missed on the electricity revolution, as you're just alluding to. They haven't caught up to that revolution, and also the internet revolution, right? The access to the internet, the broadband. But what I felt was that they really do not want to miss on this one. And obviously, the other two are sort of prerequisites. If you don't have electricity and you don't have access to the internet, your ability, it's not zero, but your ability to use AI is rather limited. But here's the good news. Once you have the other two, you already have AI. So it doesn't require very heavy capital investment. It does require the capital investment on electricity and on internet access that you need to do anyway for many other reasons.
But that's what I'm afraid of, Pedro,
Yeah.
is that because there is no electricity or very limited access, one is not going to be able to harness the potential of AI.
Absolutely. So that's the risk. But that gives even more reason for us, because also, as you know, there are many competing priorities. Where are countries going to allocate resources, right? Scarce resources. Is it infrastructure? Is it a hospital? Is it a health clinic? Is it a road? Is it a port? Is it an airport? So there are many competing demands. And I think for countries themselves with their resources and for the international community, I think with AI, the calculus, the cost-benefit analysis on where to allocate resources may be, as I said, may give even more reason for us to really do the investments and allocate the resources to the communities that currently still don't have access to electricity and internet. So that's how I would look at it.
Okay, the final question I have for you, and this is something based on a recent UN meta-study of all UN reports. I haven't seen the original study, but I read some media reports about this, actually in Asian and African media, that the UN produces all of these reports, but the headline is that it isn't always read. Even if they're downloaded, they may not be read. And apparently the average is like 1,000 downloads or something. But here, Pedro, your report, I think, stands out. So give us a little sense of how often or how many downloads does the HDR get, and how do you see it being actually used in national policy debates? People are reading these executive summaries or actually reading the detailed analysis in these hundreds of pages of reports?
This is one of the things that keeps me awake at night. Obviously the state of the world, but UNDP and the international community makes all this investment in supporting our office to put out these reports. Does anyone read them? So we are obsessive about tracking impact. And what we're seeing is that we have yearly downloads of our Human Development Report that go into the hundreds of thousands, 500,000, 600,000.
Really?
So massive number of downloads the report or views of the online version of the report combined. And also we have many people that come to use our report and use our data. We have 1,250,000 visits and downloads of our data a year. So it's at scale that really has we are proud of this, that has no comparison with other metrics of other reports.
Is this the most popular UN document?
I cannot say that for sure because I don't have access to all but it certainly, it's not like we compete and we appreciate the work that other organizations.
Of course you compete, come on.
We compete, but in a friendly way. But for instance, just to give you an example, with the World Development Report of the World Bank, if we get our numbers right, we have about 3 times as many downloads as the World Development Report of the World Bank. So it's quite widely downloaded. But, we are not satisfied with that, right? We track references to our report in media. And I'll make a point in a moment. So these are also widespread. And another interesting thing of our reports is that they have a long shelf life.
Yeah.
So many reports make a splash when they are launched, but our reports are long-lived. They continue to be referenced. They continue to be used. So we track that in the media. We also track citations in the academic literature. So one of our best customers are researchers, right, in academia that use our data, that engage with our content. So we track that as well. And then finally, we track references in policy documents. Are our reports used in budget legislation of countries, in planning documents of countries? And so what we've seen is that not only are our reports used, but they are actually increasing. So it comes back to the beginning of our conversation. Why are we doing this 35 years after the first Human Development Report came in 1990? It's not only that it's widely used in all these dimensions, but actually its use and its reach is increasing. So it's very gratifying for us to see this.
Please keep up the good work, Pedro, and congratulations on yet another exciting report. Some of my students, of course, have this in their syllabus, so we try to make sure that you guys have even more downloads. It was great fun, as always, to chat with you, Pedro. Thanks very much for coming on the show today.
Likewise, a pleasure, Dan. Anytime.
Thank you for listening to In Pursuit of Development with Professor Dan Banik from the University of Oslo. Please email your questions, comments and suggestions to inpursuitofdevelopment@gmail.com.